tough lead-in. It's sort of like saying, say something funny, right? Like, now it better be pretty decent what I have to say. I'm talking today on this topic, kind of boring title, I gave History and Thomas Kuhn's Decisive Transformation of the Image of Science. I'll explain that quote in a little bit. But the essential tension piece sort of gives you a sense of what he means by this image of science. You notice he's quite critical about his audience and their idea of an image of science. And I'll be talking, basically situating this essay. Let me see if this microphone is I want to record this. I need to speak into the microphone. Situating Thomas Kuhn's essential tension essay in terms of the very famous book that he wrote, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Before I start, I don't know which of your sections have read The Essential Tension already and which haven't. How many of you have read the essay already? Okay, so most but not all of you. And I'll treat it as if you haven't, but I'll also try not to bore you by too much sort of reconstruction of the argument. By famous book, it's kind of hard to say how famous this book was. It's listed on almost every list in the 20th century of most influential books. One of the 20 most influential books for Times Literary Supplement in London. The most cited book in the arts and the humanities between 1950 and 1990. It's really a tremendously powerful argument that Kuhn puts together here. And I think it's interesting just to hear a little bit about it, just to know what an influential book is in academia and what an influential book is in the sciences. For many of you, if you have teachers in the sciences, this is almost the default way scientists often think about what the act of science is in the present. And it's in part because Kuhn did such a good job of taking apart this idea of the image of science that he thought his audience had when he was speaking to them in 1959 at a convention in Utah, of all places. So what I'm going to do today is basically set up the essential tension essay. I kind of like to walk away from the microphone, but they want to record this, so I'm going to try to hit the balance on this. Set up the essential tension essay in the context of the structure of scientific revolutions, essentially because the two of them make the same argument in opposite ways. The essential tension book basically is arguing to a bunch of psychologists who gather to try to figure out the roots of creativity, and specifically are being paid by the US government to try to figure out scientific creativity ahead of time. And Kuhn comes in very coolly, and as I'll turn to in a minute, almost sort of nastily, and attacks his audience, and basically says, you're looking for creativity, individual creativity, you're thinking about the entire problem incorrectly. And he basically sort of sets up an argument of saying, in fact, normative science, the concept of what he calls a convergent science in the lingo of their era, is in fact the root of real creativity. And a purely inchoate individual creativity doesn't really exist. And this is sort of what the argument is making, saying there's an essential tension between structure and creativity, and that's what makes it of interest. The book, on the other hand, is making the same argument in almost the opposite way. It's essentially saying there is a structure to a scientific revolution, to creativity. And it becomes incredibly famous precisely because it starts to explain what that structure is. And this is why it's so cited not only in the sciences, but in humanities and in the arts. So whereas the essay, or it's originally a talk, whereas the talk basically is arguing for a sort of the importance of normativity, the book is going to be arguing for what creativity is, and then more than that, it will be asking what the structure of that is within science. And that will become sort of the difference. I think by comparing the two, we can sort of use them as a combination of lenses, to use a sort of microscope, telescope example, to try to get more of what the overall argument is. And also try to be able to make sense of what makes Kuhn's book so revolutionary. And I'll conclude by sort of situating that within the overall pattern of history of science. Let me just note then the importance, what people tend to take from the structure of scientific revolutions as a book is the idea of paradigm shift. How many of you have heard of this idea of paradigm shift? A good number of you, but not all of you. It's essentially a term that comes from this book to become more or less a common parlance in the sciences. He uses it, for instance, I mean, it's used, I just looked on Google to find places where it's used. Here is something from June 27th, paradigm shift, the MIT city car and the future of urban design. The notion being that paradigm shift will be a sudden radical perception or shift in how people perceive reality. Right? And this becomes sort of a false translation of Kuhn, as almost all great ideas tend to get falsely translated, but in popular reception, the notion of a radical transformative thought. I'll give you some other examples. Adrian Grenier has a blog. It came up as number 5. Is the paradigm shifting, right? And he actually has an organization called Shift, SHFT. Finally, we have a right-wing blog that showed up also on my list. Sarah Palin taking Texas is also a paradigm shift, right? So the notion that a general radical change in the way people look at things gets accepted into the English language, particularly into American English, from Kuhn almost directly. And that shift, in turn, is part of what will be considered important about the book. As I mentioned, as often is the case, and as you'll see a lot of times in Language and Thought, really great books and really great ideas almost are never directly accepted. Indeed, I would argue, by definition, they're never directly accepted or received, right? There's always a mistranslation there. And in this case, paradigm shift, for a number of reasons, becomes sort of bastardized in its reception. It sort of loses a lot of its original importance. What people take it to mean, though, is a radical transformation. I always like this cover because it plays on a key idea Kuhn adds to the end of the book in the second edition, which is to say it's sort of like a Gestalt translation, right? In which, you take this famous example of the Miller cube, you can imagine the cube as if it's coming out towards you or as if it's shifting back to you, right? It's equipositional, it has 2 different ways of being. Or to take another Gestalt image, let's see, famous one, is this a bunny rabbit or is it a duck? Right, we've seen this before probably, we can see the bunny rabbit and the duck. Right, Kuhn wanted to say a paradigm shift has the effect on perception of allowing this kind of transformation, and the reason he liked the example is precisely because the same elements mean different things, right? The idea that you have the same elements of a scientific problem can be transformed through perception into an entirely different whole, and he thought a paradigm shift would do this. The way in which this is a disaster in its popular reception is that everybody thought paradigm shift was exactly a matter of individual genius, of individual perception, and instant change. Whereas what he's going to ultimately argue is that paradigm shifts are caused by structures of community and structures of institutions, much more so than simply the individual creativity that the psychologists in 1959 were looking at. So let's take these 2 arguments and break them down a little bit, and then we'll come back to what this point is. First, we'll look at the essential tension argument. It's a little bit simpler, I think. Essentially, starting off with the argument that in some ways he's been asked to come there to speak to psychologists about the nature of creativity. And as I mentioned, he's actually quite hostile. If you go back and look what he says, I'm not altogether sanguine about the outcome of your research on me. Right? This is the way he talks starts by talking to a room of psychologists. In other words, he's automatically sort of a bit distant, and he's also saying, I don't think actually I'm the right person for what you want to say. And if you'll notice by the end of the essay, he says not only that, he says, in fact, you're part of the problem. You're part of why the United States is not achieving creativity in the sciences, right? He goes on to say, implicit in the image of the scientific papers distributed to participants in this conference is an image of scientific process and of the scientist. That image almost certainly conditions many of the experiments you try as well as the conclusions you draw. Right, so he's speaking to psychologists at this conference, and clearly by that term, image of science, he's saying you have it wrong. Right? This is a pretty nasty thing to tell a room full of people who've all traveled from all over the world to Utah, or from all over the United States. He's basically saying the concept through which you think of science is totally wrong, and because of that, the solution you're looking for you didn't get. And on top of that, I don't even know if I trust your entire field. Right? You're experimenting on me. I actually wondered why he went to this conference in the first place until when I looked this up, I realized that it's not in Salt Lake City. I thought it was in Alta, Utah. And he's flown out there as a graduate student. It's a beautiful mountaintop area in June 1959. There's a lot of money floating around for this kind of research, how to make the U.S. stronger in science. And Kuhn will be at the sort of cutting edge for this. Why is there so much money floating around in science? Quick answer. This thing, does anybody know what it is? Sputnik, yeah, right? The Russians launched Sputnik, the satellite. It's basically a small radio transceiver. It completely terrifies the Western world. And Kuhn's entire piece is based on the notion that the U.S. has fallen behind in natural science in particular, right? He's basically saying, compared to the Russians, compared to the rest of the world, we're completely behind. And again, this might seem sort of odd to us now, but just to give you some sense of this, we now think of the U.S. as sort of a leader in science. But here, this is the number of Nobel Prizes awarded. And you can see, starting around 1930, it starts doing pretty well, but basically the US dominance in natural science really is a product in some way of the Cold War and Cold War military funding. And that's what Kuhn is essentially talking about.